Welcome back to season 5 of What, Why, God. And in this season, we are focusing on the question, why not God? And asking a lot of people around the congregation and that have different fields that they work in. And John Lockemeyer is with us today, and he has been with us in our first season, talking about science. And a lot of people have the concept of, well, science and faith don't mesh. And we talked about that in our first video a little bit. But we're going to go a smidge deeper this time, just a smidge, because like he said, we'd be here all day. Or 2 days.
Something like that, yeah.
Because there really is quite a plethora of information out there. So John is an inorganic chemist. He has done a talk, it's a 5-week class, about Genesis and the Bible, right? The creation story, basically. And so he talks about, and so if you're doing 5 classes, and I'm sure he's only touching on it because he sent me, and I will put this in our links in the description. The amount of information he has, the amount of books, it's overwhelming. It really is quite overwhelming.
And that just scratches the surface.
Yeah, it's a scratch to the surface. So we're going to give you a little scratch on the surface so you can get an understanding of just how much we don't understand. But also how much science really does point to something greater. So let's just kind of start right there. Let's talk about this creation story in Genesis. So give us some highlights of that, the Big Bang theory maybe versus and the creation of species and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so it's a big drink of water, huh?
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many things to touch on. But I like, when I set up the class, first of all, I was curious myself. And so I started reading a lot of books and looking online for content, and there's so much now right at your fingertips, including videos. And I really, after teaching it a couple of times, landed on a few themes, I would say, that people were most interested in. One is the huge discrepancy apparent discrepancy between the age of the universe and the age of the earth, with respect to what some people read from Bible account. And of course, there's another big one is the evolution. And if you go before evolution, the origin of life.
Right.
How can life come from inanimate matter?
Right.
And so those are kind of the main themes, and we dove into each of those in subsections. The Big Bang, for example, is one concept that most people only hear about it. Okay, everybody knows what an explosion is, so a Big Bang makes sense to them. But
right.
But the details really matter.
Yeah.
And
that was posited by a priest originally, right?
The Big Bang theory was originally posited by George Lemaitre, who's a Belgian priest.
Okay.
And he was interpreting data from Edwin Hubble, who was the first to, they were both cosmologists and astrophysicists. Lemaitre was an astrophysicist as well. Hubble was an astronomer. And so Hubble was the first to find evidence that galaxies were moving away from each other.
Expanding.
So the interpretation was that the universe was expanding.
Right.
Before then, the belief was that it was a constant. It was just, everything was just static and here. So Lemaitre did a bunch of measurements in math and came to the conclusion that if it's expanding now, as you go backwards in time, you come to a point in time where there was literally just nothing.
Yeah.
And everything came from that point.
Yeah.
And he worked out the math that fit with Einstein's theories. So
interesting.
So all of that came together, and eventually the phrase Big Bang was coined, but I don't think it was by Lemaitre himself. But yeah, so then it's a lot of debate about, okay, if you do the calculations, you come up with the age of the universe being something like 14 billion years old. That's not 6 days.
No,
I think it's well outside the error bars of measurement here.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
How do you reconcile those two? That that's one of the themes that I spent a whole maybe class and a half or almost 2 classes on that particular part, because there's some very good work, some excellent books written by a guy named Gerald Schrader, who's a physicist who used to be at MIT, and now he's in Israel, and he teaches Hebrew Bible. So he's a Hebrew Bible scholar.
Wow.
And a physicist. And he wrote these fascinating books. There are several of them, but the one that I keyed off of originally was called Genesis and the Big Bang. Mm. And he basically sets up an argument that you can reconcile these two because we know the universe is expanding.
Right.
Time expands too.
Yeah.
So Einstein proved that space and time are the same.
Yeah.
And so if you go back in time, you can actually back calculate how many years when we look back, each day account from Genesis would be equal to. And they change.
Yeah.
They double every day, so to speak. And then he takes what we know from astronomy and cosmology about formation of the universe. When light appeared, for example, light wasn't always there. Yeah. Time wasn't always there. I mean, these are things you don't normally consider. Because it's all here now. Because
it's always here. But the Big Bang really did kind of change a lot of that, though, then, right? Yeah. And I was thinking, too, as you were mentioning that, and I'm just going to just my little point in here, is that, so when you see, like when you throw something in and it creates a ripple, it's really fast initially, and then it just kind of slows down. Would that be a similar kind of thought process of what you're talking about there? Like, like you throw a rock in the water, it creates this big splash.
Right.
And water sprays everywhere. Things go everywhere. And then you see the ripples.
So there are...
something like that, maybe?
Are you talking about the rock being the initiation of the Big Bang?
Yes.
Okay. You can draw that metaphor because one of the big discoveries in the 1960s, I believe it was, don't want to say for sure, but there were 2 scientists that were looking with a radio telescope into the sky, and they were looking for what they thought might be the echo from the Big Bang.
I remember hearing about that, yeah.
And so that echo, because, well, if you go back to the original form of light that came eventually from the Big Bang, it would be incredibly energetic, beyond X-rays, kind of energetic. But because the universe is expanding, those waves get stretched out. So your analogy is a nice one. The waves get stretched out, and now we see them as microwaves, which are really relatively low energy waves.
Yeah.
And they found it all over the sky. And so there was a satellite that was sent up to map the sky, the entire sky, for microwave radiation. And what they found was that it wasn't uniform, for one thing, which was kind of surprising.
Yeah.
And it actually had to be that way because in the beginning, it was just energy. And energy essentially condenses into matter.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's interesting.
And so there has to be bright spots and dark spots in order for galaxies to form later on, matter to form. All these things didn't exist in the beginning. And to go back to what Schrader has in his books, it's really remarkable because one of the ways that we really get tripped up in interpreting Genesis is with the English translations.
Okay, yeah.
And he points
out...
That's
a good point.
He points this out, because...
Go back to the original text.
You go back to the original Hebrew, and there are very subtle differences, he points out, in the verbs that are used, the tenses of the verbs, and how it completely changes when man enters the picture. The perspective of time changes. He points out that, and a lot of people know this, the first letter in Genesis is an open form symbol like this, and it's as if God is speaking. It's like a shape of a mouth, which is kind of remarkable.
That is crazy.
Because the first thing that happens,
speaks.
He speaks the universe into existence.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, these subtle things really matter, and they get lost in different interpretations over time. And it was really interesting to read that and find that each day expands to a different number of years, and then you can correlate each of these periods to what we know now from paleontology and cosmology about when light first appeared, when the planets first formed,
Right.
when the sky became clear, when animals appeared, and they line up really nicely according to the
Like
calculations.
a step-by-step kind of process.
He
is what
goes
you're
through
saying.
each biblical day.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And the number of years it is as we look back now, because
Yeah.
the biblical days are in God's perspective.
Yeah.
But the most amazing thing is when you do this calculation, and I've done the calculation myself with modern data, more modern data. His was 10 years ago or something, and there's more recent data. But this 14 billion years, when you squeeze it back down, comes out to 6 24-hour periods, 6 days.
That is
It's a mind blower, right? It's like nuts.
That's crazy.
So, okay, is it a coincidence?
I don't think so.
I mean, a skeptic would say so, but then when you expand it, and each of those days correlates with what's going on from what we know from science and what's taught in the Bible, there's a remarkable similarity.
That's astounding to
me. It is
astounding. That's astounding. Well, and
I always look to see if anybody fell off their chair when I showed this in class, but not yet.
Well, just as a very amateur person, we talked a little bit about how there was the Cambrian explosion, right? Where did all of these things come from all at once?
All at once.
All at once.
Fully formed.
Well, and that's the other thing, people say, well, men came and well, it's interesting that even the DNA people take it all the way back to one man and one woman. And you have to ask yourself, well, where did they come from? And I do believe they were fully formed. I mean, it says in the Bible they were fully formed. And if we believe in a God that is that big and that great, he can do that. He can just do that.
Yeah. Well, if you want to step into the evolution topic, that's where we would go.
Well, we can go right back. Yeah,
we can
let's define evolution a little bit so that people
first.
Understand it, because I know there's some confusion because it's still taught quite a bit now, and it's not really the same anymore. So let's define our terms when we say evolution.
Right. So, you can unpack it a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
The origin, no pun intended, is from Darwin's book, The Origin of the Species, where he, after being on a voyage on a ship, the Beagle, I believe is the Beagle, he saw all these different species and variations within the species.
Right.
And he came to the very correct conclusion that each species has variety because they adapt to their conditions in order to better survive. And this is why the survival of the fittest terminology comes up. But he went a step further. He said that you can evolve from one species to the next.
Right.
And what's interesting is in his book, probably about 7 times, he says the evidence doesn't exist for the in-between, but use your imagination. Fill in the blanks.
Right.
Okay, that was a long time ago.
Right.
There's still no evidence to show a jump between species. So even evolutionary biologists today will tell you this, that the data doesn't exist. In fact, if you go back to the Cambrian explosion, Charles Walcott, who was the paleontologist who discovered that, the fossil record, which was in the Burgess Shale in the Rocky Mountains in Western Canada, he found all of these fully formed soft tissue species, fossils, and I think they're between 60 and 80,000 specimens, and they were sent to his lab in the Smithsonian Institute. And he was a Darwinist, so he did not want to point out that he couldn't find anything that was in between the species. It wasn't until the 1980s when a graduate student by the name of Conway, he he found these fossils in a drawer, basically in a back room. Walcott was hiding them because he knew that it didn't support the Darwin theory.
Oh.
So there's that cognitive dissonance going on.
And we talked a little bit about that. What do we call it?
The Santa Claus kind of concept.
Yeah, I was thinking of it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I can't think of the word that I was going to use. But yeah, I mean, it is, it's a cognitive dissonance, but it's also like we want to make sure that everything we find supports what we want it to find, what we want it to support.
This is a typical trap in science.
Yeah.
Because people get wrapped up in the theory that they've developed, and their ego is tied into it. And so, and I always, when I mentor younger scientists, I tell them, be careful about this one because you'll paint yourself in a corner.
Yeah.
Don't let your ego get wrapped up in your theories because then it becomes personal.
Yeah.
When the data doesn't agree with what you're proposing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the evidence was hidden for a long time, but even so, after it was discovered, the Paleontological Society said, the evidence we've been trying to find for over 100 years just doesn't exist. But you still find on the internet disinformation, I would call it.
Yeah.
In particular, I think it's bad for the young, impressionable people.
Yeah.
Because you see these really eloquent videos of it starts with a single cell.
Yeah. And
it becomes a more complicated creature, and then a worm, and then eventually a fish, and the fish walks on land. And they show each of those. Okay, we have records for each of those individual species, but they kind of do a blur or transition video, and it looks really plausible.
Yeah.
But it's not right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're always up against disinformation in all kinds of arenas, but this is a particularly tricky one because, in particular, if you're a Christian or if you believe in God and creation, and you say, I don't believe that evolution stuff, or species to species in particular, because and people will come back, well, that's because you're a Christian. They dismiss you.
They dismiss you, yeah.
Now, the adaptation is real. I mean, and you can see that.
Yeah.
Probably one of
natural selection. Yeah.
One of the best examples for modern day is antibiotic resistant bacteria. Mm-hmm. Because they reproduce so quickly, you can see generation to generation changes. Eventually, there's some that survive because, one of them was resistant, and it survived and multiplied.
Right. Right.
So that's real. But the species to species thing, there's still no evidence for it.
Yeah, I know people point to mutations too, but that a mutation doesn't change a species.
No, it can cause them to adapt or die. Typically, it's bad, right?
Yeah, typically
it causes disease and you die.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, Francis Collins, who's one of the people that was working on the Human Genome Project and is a Christian and a scientist, he said, be careful about filling in the gaps with God as the explanation.
That. Yeah.
Because if a gap shows up in a scientific explanation, your faith could be in jeopardy.
I think too, when you mentioned that you tell kids, be careful about the important thing about the research that you do and all the things that you do, even if you're wrong, you've still proven something, that, well, that doesn't necessarily work. That doesn't work. So, I mean, it's all about learning more. So being wrong is something, I mean, we all know that when we learn by our mistakes. And so I would just encourage anybody that, if you've been tackling something, it means you're still searching and you're still seeking. And now you've learned, well, that wasn't it. And so you just move on to the next thing, I think.
You look at one of the most successful companies we see today, which is SpaceX.
Yeah.
And people say, oh, you crashed a rocket. And he said, but we learned a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we won't make that same mistake again.
Yeah.
So yeah, you should be able to learn as much from what you don't find in an experiment, or, for example, in science.
Yeah.
And this is another thing I mentor younger staff about is design your experiments. If you're so sure about your theory, design an experiment that contradicts it.
That's a really good idea. Yeah.
And then you should get a negative result if you're right.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an excellent idea.
Because you
I
don't
love
want
it.
to be spending lots of time going down this blind alley.
Yeah.
And I've learned this in project work. It's just as important to learn what you can't do
Absolutely.
in a project as it is what you
Absolutely.
can do.
So let's kind of add on top of that. So we talked a little bit about what we do know. So talk to me about some of the latest discoveries that you've heard. I mean, I know, again, we could be here all day, but maybe some touch on some of these, like you talked about the complexity of life. We talked a little bit about that. You also mentioned, speaking about that some of these other ideas that people have come up with are pure fantasy, basically, but they purport it to be real. So what are some of the new discoveries, and what do you think people are like, okay, there's nothing to support that. How can you tell the difference?
We can take it from bookends. We go back to Big Bang. So according to the theory, everything started from a single point, and all matter and antimatter and some matter survived, by the way, and they don't know why. That's all of this.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
All that formed, and they've been able, cosmologists in particular, according to the equations that gauge the expansion of the universe and how matter behaves and all of this, they figure out when galaxies should first appear in the timeline. And I think it's in the billions of years. But with the James Webb telescope, that telescope, which I've seen live, by the way, is really cool, that was specifically designed to see and detect the first light. So when light appeared from the Big Bang, because light wasn't always there.
Yeah.
When that showed up in what's described in Genesis as broke free, which is really close to the scientific reality, that it comes out of a plasma state and atoms form and light gets away. So it's designed to see that very first light. And because the universe is stretched,
right,
that light is very red now compared to the intense energy it was before. Well, one of the things they found at only 250 million years after the Big Bang, so 250 million years, was fully formed galaxies. And they still don't know what's going on here because there shouldn't even be stars yet. So how could it be galaxies? So
that's
something's
crazy.
wrong with the theory, or they're trying to sort out if there's some artifact about how they're doing the measurement that doesn't quite fit. So those kind of things. This is the beauty of science. Every time you do an experiment, you come across something, almost always, that you can't quite figure out, and it leads to a couple more.
Yeah.
The other end of the spectrum is origin of life, and how you get from inanimate matter, in particular simple molecules like methane and water and ammonia. So there's a classic experiment that was done in the 50s called the Erie-Miller experiment, where they took what they thought was the components of the atmosphere, and they said, well, if you have enough energy, like in the form of lightning, you can make reactions go that would form the compounds that are necessary for life. So they did this experiment, made a spark in a reaction flask, and they got amino acids.
Amino acids, yeah.
Okay, great, but it's a long way to go from amino acids to a living
organism,
much less a person.
Yeah.
So there's a professor at Rice University, James Tour, who has got a lot of content on the web about this origin of life stuff, and he's an organic chemist. I'm an inorganic chemist. He's an organic chemist, so he knows the reactions, in particular synthetic inorganic chemist. He knows how to make all kinds of molecules, what's necessary, what conditions, how much time it takes. And he's also a Christian. So he gets attacked on his opinion that there's no possible way that you can get a single cell, for example, from random reactions.
Yeah.
Because in one of the things that you find in past literature, and I think some people still believe this, if you have enough time, enough random events, you'll eventually get there. Well, if you do the math, that's absurd.
Yeah.
For one thing.
Yeah.
But his argument, Tour's argument, is that time is the enemy.
Yeah.
And he's not the only one who said this.
Yeah.
And as a chemist, I get this because when you make a compound in the laboratory, the first thing you do is you isolate it, you purify it, so it doesn't go on and form.
It's got to be perfect.
So it doesn't decompose
Mm-hmm.
or react with other things.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get that chance in nature.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't. So that's a tough one to get around.
Yeah.
And then the complexity of the cell, there's some fantastic videos and
Yeah.
explanations of these things
Yeah.
online. Veritasium is a good web link where they talk about how cells are put together and the molecules that like walking molecules and things. It's just
it's
remarkable.
crazy. I've seen some of that. Yeah.
It's just remarkable.
Yeah.
And there's tens of thousands of different components that need to be put together right. And
Yeah. Yeah.
just in the membrane itself, it's
Yeah.
complicated. So
Yeah, we mentioned something about the fine tuning of the universe, right? And we just find, and that's not just the universe. That's our bodies. That's everything. It's just so finely tuned, and there's just it's so perfect. And it would be one thing if it were one thing, like you mentioned to me, right?
But it's not.
Yeah.
So the fine tuning one argument is. There's only one answer to it now, and we can go into that. But the fine tuning is, there are these physical constants in the universe that need to be just right. I mean, tuned within, 13 zeros plus and then a number, kind of decimal place or more. The gravitational constant. So if it was too small, as the universe expands, everything would fly apart.
Right.
If it's too big, everything would clump together. But it's in between. It's actually just right so that planets can form, so that galaxies can form, so that stars can form. Stars are the big one because that provides the energy for us to live and for reactions to happen. There's so many, though. The presence of carbon, which is a tricky atom to make. Atoms are synthesized in stars. Mm-hmm. And there's so many. So the alternative explanation, the one that atheists or skeptics will point to, is a more recent theory, which is that, okay, well, we have all these constants in the universe that are tuned just right, but if you have an infinite number of universes, one of them's going to get it just right. And so now they're actually trying to explain how this is possible, and mathematically it appears that it's possible, but unfortunately there's no way to prove it because a different universe has different physical constants. Our instruments can't measure other stuff. Yeah. So they have to infer it. Yeah. And what they're doing now, very recently, is doing work with quantum computers and finding bizarre things that they can only explain by having another universe present. But that's a far cry from establishing a proof.
Yeah, and I think that's again, it's gotten to the point where we're going to do everything we can to make sure that we can't point to God, in my opinion.
Well, it's uncomfortable for people.
Yeah.
They want to rely on things they know.
Right.
They can see, that they can measure, they can touch. But science, in particular, the kind of science that is required to explain origin of life or beginning of the universe, this requires some faith as well.
Yes.
I mean, that's why when theories are developed, they're called theories.
Right.
And they don't become laws until there's a mountain of evidence to get behind them.
Yeah, I that's a really good point, because I think a lot of people go, well, this is known, this is solid science, this is not debatable, evolution, everybody knows. And I'm thinking to myself, no, they still call it the theory of evolution. They still call it the theory of, and until they say it's a law, which you don't hear, we haven't heard that word in a long time for anything new. And so I agree. It is, we have to just be very careful when people, and one of the reasons I sent him an article that I was looking at that talked about why not God. And he mentioned some of these sorts of things that people, and it's almost like a filling in the gap, Christians try to fill in the gap, but on the other end, it's really a way to try and say, I don't need God.
Right? Because once you believe in God, there's a lot that follows that impacts your life.
Yeah.
Or should.
Yeah.
If you're serious about it at all, then you should be seeking what God means,
right.
what God wants from us.
Right.
And eventually that leads to, for Christians anyway, and Hebrew folks, is reading the Bible.
Yeah.
And then it's a matter of interpretation and what aspects of it you stress.
Yeah.
So I think it takes more faith actually to be an atheist.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't prove God's not there.
Yeah. So as you're teaching these classes and you're talking to people about the science, and actually it's a beautiful thing, because we're learning about God's world and how he's created it. And it is mind blowing. I think you have a lot more understanding of, I don't understand. Somebody had mentioned this, and I think I did this in another video too, where, this is you, and this is what you know, and this is what you don't know. And then this is you 10 years later. This is what you know. This is what you don't know. And then there's you 10 years later. This is what you know. This is what you don't know. And then, as we go on, we don't know what we don't know. And to make assumptions about things we don't know about is really bad. So how would you, as a scientist, and kids come into you and asking you, all these people say these things to me, how am I supposed to respond? These, and I have a teacher that says, well, like I told you how I went to the history museum downtown, and they were saying, and this evolved from this and this, and these are still in museums. How do you have those kinds of conversations with people?
Yeah. First off, I tell them, don't be adversarial. Don't just start pushing back, because when you do that, then the person that is challenging you is going to close, and they're going to dismiss your thinking. You have to have something in your hip pocket to say, okay, you're claiming, you say the evolution is the thing, and I'm silly for not believing in it, but where's the evidence for interspecial development? Tell me why do you believe it? Is it because someone told you that? If they told you that, where's their reference? What is their source?
Yeah.
And this is particularly a big problem nowadays, because people tend to think that whatever they find on the internet is truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a lot of misguided information on the internet, and some of it is disguised as science. So you have to be very discerning. As a scientist, one of my responsibilities has been to review journal articles that other chemists or catalyst researchers in particular would submit to journals. So the way it works is they submit to the editor finds people in the field who are experts, and they send a request for you to review that paper. And sometimes there are papers that are just fantastic and publish this right away, but sometimes, like what you're proposing here, you don't have the evidence for it. No, you shouldn't publish this. So it's challenging, but you have to be prepared. You have to have some information in order to have a decent conversation with people. And it's tricky, because there's a world against Christianity, certainly, in particular about creation and how man mankind came to be. Some will come back and say, well, aliens put us here. It's like, okay,
Where did they come from?
Where did they come from? Because now all you're doing is kicking the can down the road.
Yeah.
That just makes it more time required to make it happen. And there isn't enough time in the age of the universe to have this happen.
Yeah.
From random events. If you do the math, that doesn't work out.
Yeah. I think it's a really important thing is not to be confrontational. And I think ask a lot of good questions and ask them, I'd love to see the research on that.
Yeah. How do you know that?
Yeah.
Why do you think that's the truth?
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's because they heard it from somebody who's really smart. I said, well, don't put your faith, you gotta be careful of putting your faith in someone else's belief, even because they're smart.
Yeah.
You have to come about your own faith in your own way, on your own path.
Yeah.
You need to convince yourself of this, or otherwise you will always be doubting.
Yeah, and I also think there is a lot that science can't tell us. And when somebody is dealing with something emotional or something hard, that's not a scientific concern. And we know that we are sentient beings that think, and I think, therefore I am. And there are things that just science cannot answer. And I think sometimes if somebody's being a little pushback, sometimes it's good just to get to know the person and find out what's really going on in their life. And, maybe it's a heart issue, and it's not that. It's them being angry about something.
It can be that. It can be typically the people they're surrounded by. And it may be very difficult to be contrary to what they're being told. It's very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
If it's your own family, for example, or certainly your circle of friends, particularly important for young people. They want to be accepted.
Yeah.
So
it'll take some time. You're not going to change somebody's mind.
No.
In one conversation.
But doubt is not the opposite of faith. It's an element of faith.
Yes, that's very true.
Yeah.
I'm glad you said that.
I think, is that C.S. Lewis or Francis Collins? I can't remember which one of those two.
I'm quite sure C.S. Lewis said something like that.
That sounds like him. It sounds more like him.
It does sound like him. Yes. Doubting is good to the extent that it makes you want to learn more and finding out more about the truth. And so it's an important part of learning about who we are, what we believe, and asking good questions.
Yeah, God created us, I believe, to seek him. And so I tell people, stay curious.
Yes.
Just keep seeking. Right?
Yeah. That's great. Thank you so much. I know this probably went a little longer than you had anticipated.
Oh, I'm just getting started.
I know. Well, I was telling him when we were talking, I said, I find this stuff fascinating. I could sit and talk to you all day long about this because I do find it fascinating, because just knowing about how God created things. And I think, the initial idea when Christians got involved in all of this was so that they could learn more about God's creation and be dumbfounded. I was just learning something about how they mapped the stars, or how they created the calendars, and they were always a little bit off. And it was finally somebody said, the planets were in an ellipse, and everybody always thought they were a circle. And
that's Newton.
Yeah. And so it was like, it's, the things that we have learned it's how does this all work together? And it's exciting, I think, to learn them and to get on. So anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tiri,
for having me here. And I hope you got something out of this. I want you to understand that the science is never set. We learn something new all the time. And more than anything else, just be curious. And for those around you that might be feeling a little uncomfortable about it, help them to be curious too. And really, there are questions that God can answer that have nothing to do with science. And we always want to dig deeper and have good relationships so that you can have those kinds of conversations. And it's not going to happen overnight if somebody's really seeking God. So why not God? Because he's got a whole lot going on, and he can take care of just about anything, because he created this wonderful world and all of us too. So thanks so much for being with us. And please like, share, and subscribe. If you have a question, feel free to put it in an email to me at online@firstcolonychurch.org. And if you have a question for John, I can send it his way too. You'll see him here on Sunday mornings for a little bit longer. So anyway, thanks again so much. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.